So one of your other best-known projects is Grand Theft Auto, and we're kind of in that period when the consoles came out. So
Yeah.
how did that kind of come about? How did it develop?
So let's see, it would have been around the start of '94. I was kind of left to my own devices after finishing Lemmings 2 on the SNES. So I got to do basically just R&D on whatever I wanted. And I started out by wanting to do some kind of isometric game. I'd never done one before. So I thought I'd sit and just figure out how isometric stuff worked and the best way of doing it. Once I had that up, I kind of realized, for a modern PC at that time, simple isometric games are a bit bland and who cares? So I decided I wanted to try and get it to rotate a bit more freely, so it was a bit more 3D-ish, but still isometric. So I did this rotating 3D isometric game engine and showed it to Dave, and he gave it off to one of the teams to see if we can come up with a game for this engine. And while they were doing that, I decided to try and do some other just tech stuff. Turned out, though, that I think it was Syndicate Wars. Syndicate Wars was...
Yeah. That was isometric, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a rotating isometric thing. Came out, and the storyline was similar to the ones the guys were doing, and we just didn't like the gameplay at all in it. We just didn't think the isometric stuff really did anything for it, and it was a bit clunky and so on. Fortunately, I'd been starting on another engine using the same framework. I had this kind of cube world where it was just a big 3D array of cubes, which is what the isometric stuff was made out of. And I changed the viewport of it. I've been seeing a game on the Sega Saturn called Clockwork Knight.
Oh, yeah, I remember that, yeah.
And it had a side-on perspective view, which I really liked. I think it was probably the first one to really do that. I wondered if you could do that in the PC. Because it was just all these kind of flat blocks, I decided to try and do it using what we've kind of called the Doom wall rendering, which is either a straight vertical or a straight horizontal, but with scaling lines so you get a bit of perspective in it. It means you don't have to do full polygons, which is much faster, and you can get a bit more control over it. I'd started out by trying to put basically a side-on scrolling platformer using this kind of thing and my cube world that I had running. And I showed some of the other guys. They'd said they'd been trying to get a racing game past Dave for years, but he wasn't interested in it. And I suddenly realised that if I just put basically a wall in the distance, but then painted roads on this wall, then all of a sudden it changes from side on to top down. So I all of a sudden had this kind of top down city thing. Wow. That I then showed Dave. He was kind of fascinated in the thought of being able to have a much more controlled view of a city that he could probably populate and actually make it a living city. Because that's always a problem. If you go into 3D, you've got very far distance, or you cull it and it looks a bit naff. Whereas this had a very tightly controlled viewport that you could, imaginably fill the city and have a really busy city going. So I handed that over to Keith and the guys to actually try using this engine instead. And that obviously went a lot better than the first one.